have other classes up until 7. Okay, thanks.
We're going to get started.
Yes, I'll probably on the 17. I think there are some few more gifted. But you can go ahead and get started. They'll just fill in as they come in. If you like.
Oh, okay. Great.
Let's reward these guys for being on time.
Yay. Okay. So hi, I'm Catherine Chandler, and I'm the new curator here at the Bridwell. I just moved here a week ago from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, so everything is entirely new to me here. So you'll have to forgive me as I stumble about a bit. These materials are new to me as well, but you know, I'll have some background or knowledge of many of them from other items I've worked with. So we'll see how I do. So thank you for bearing with me, as it were. Since your class is about the Bible with Jewish and Christian Bibles, I wanted to first get out a couple of these scrolls. They're Jewish scrolls. This large one is a Torah, and the smaller one is actually a Megillah, or a Book of Esther.
Define Torah for this.
Oh, okay.
We're really at beginner stage.
So a Torah is, well, and you're going to have to help me with this. A Torah is only certain books of the Old Testament.
It's just the Pentateuch. It's the first five books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy.
Okay. This, and a lot of times, you know, especially for the use in a synagogue, you're going to see it in this large format, this large scroll format. This one is very special one. There's two that the Bridwell has. And this one was actually appropriated to the Bridwell. It's very special because it was actually made in what is now the Czech Republic. And this is from probably the first quarter of the 19th century. And the village where it was made is actually the village where Madeleine Albright's family came from. And the Jews who lived in that village were actually taken to Nazi death camps before and during the Second World War. And all of the items in many of the Jewish synagogues that were in areas taken over by the Nazis were reappropriated to a Jewish museum in Prague. And so there was this whole system where they've tried to put these items from these synagogues into certain libraries and so forth. So there's a connection here at SMU whereby this Torah came into the Bridwell's collections. So this is a very special Torah because of its what we call provenance, meaning who it belongs to, where it came from, and so forth. It's a manuscript. That means that it was written by hand. And I think that most of these kinds of Torahs are, you're going to have to correct me on this, is that the case, that these Torahs are manuscripts?
So for reading purposes, in the context of the liturgy, in the context of prayer worship, this has to be the form in which it's read. It's never read from a book form. It's always read. And there are different styles. This is European style, and then there's also a style that gets traced back to Spain and the Eastern territories, and those are in big cases, solid cases, and they're read standing up in the case as opposed to this, which is read lying down on the table.
So in other words, is this like an Ashkenazi form, and those are Sephardic?
Exactly.
Okay. See, I have not gotten to work with the Torah before, so this is very exciting. So meaning that it's manuscript. If you guys are taking notes, that's a very basic sort of idea. If you're taking notes, you're actually making a manuscript. That is what a manuscript is. It comes from manus and scriptus, written by hand. That's the basic idea of a manuscript. So anything that is written by hand is a manuscript. It's the very basic concept. But this entire scroll was written by hand by a scribe with ink, obviously. And what the substance is here is parchment. In many cases, parchment will be vellum, which is specifically calfskin. It depends on the location where you are, what kind of animal skin it might be. In Europe, that also depends. If it's Central Europe, sometimes it can be like deer skin. Sometimes if you're in the south of Europe, it can be goat skin. And you can also have sheep skin. This is probably calf skin. It's probably vellum. And if you look closely at it, which I will invite you to do, you'll be able to see like darkening at the edges. And in the darkening of these edges, it's probably from use. But you can also sometimes see, depending on on how the parchment was prepared, you can see the particles of the animal skin and from the flesh and so forth. What we have here is a Megillah, which is the Book of Esther, very specifically, and it's prepared in the same way. It's also a scroll form. So this is also from the same time period. It's from the been dated in its catalog record very specifically to 1800. There are no notes as to why it was dated to that, and it has not been placed. So this is from around the Czech Republic. We don't know where this Esther scroll or Megillah is from, but the Book of Esther is used in particular around the festival of Purim, which is a fun festival if you're Jewish. So you get to do fun things like pie eating contests and stuff. I'm not Jewish. I'm just trying to remember what my Jewish friends do when it's Purim, but that's when they read the Book of Esther. And of course, Professor Lander can speak more about that probably at some other point, because I know we need to get through some materials. But what I do also want to say, just in terms of book history, is that the scroll is an ancient format for texts. So in antiquity, especially in the Mediterranean, where you have Rome and you have Egypt and you have Greece, they're all around the Mediterranean basin. This was the format for longer texts in the ancient world. And around late antiquity, there was a definite transition from the scroll format to the codex format or book format. And so this is something that has been retained in the Jewish faith, in the Jewish tradition, and continues to be used, for liturgical purposes. And so it's very important in book history, and it's important to see this in real life. It's very exciting. And if you're Jewish, you see this when you go to synagogue and they bring out the Torah. So is there anything that you wish to add?
Questions?
Questions?
Why did it switch from scroll to book form so late when the printing press has been around?
Well, the printing press in the West didn't happen until the 1450s. So late antiquity is around the 200s, 300s AD, is around that time when they did the transition from the scroll to the codex. So that's way, way, way before printing. However, in the East, they were actually printing, very, very early. So, but in different ways. There was stamp printing in China, and they were actually printing with woodblocks in China and Japan very, very early on. And then there were entire books being printed in China and Japan, in the early hundreds AD. So they were way ahead in terms of book production in the Far East of the West. So if we're talking about Western book history, it's a different kind of story. But actual movable type in China, they started using ceramic movable type early on. And then in Korea, they started using metal movable type in the 1300s. And then Gutenberg in the West invented, but he didn't really, the printing press around the 1400s. So the Gutenberg Bible is produced between 1450 and 1455. So that's when there was actually a revolution, and it spread all over Europe. But that was, as you can tell, in the West, that was way, way, way after the codex form. So, a lot of the attribution in the West of the transition from the roll to the codex in the West is to the early Christians, because the early Christians disseminated a lot of texts. They wrote a great deal. The Christian leaders, not all Christians could read or write, but the Christian leaders could. And if you think about using a roll and trying to use it for reference, and looking something up and then having to roll it back up again, a codex or book form lends itself much better to that. And the Romans had developed codices. They had these wax tablets that they hinged together with these straps. but they weren't used nearly as much as this kind of roll, which, by the way, they used with papyrus mostly. But then around the 200s, 300s AD, you started to see more and more of this codex format, first with papyrus pages and more with the parchment, because as the Roman Empire as the Western culture started to spread more into Europe, they had more parchment to work with, or animal skin rather than papyrus. That's a whole other story. They got their papyrus from Egypt. There's collapse of the Roman roads and the Roman Empire, and anyway, I'm not going to go into that, but yeah. So there you have it.
Any other questions before we come and look at this close up?
Do the animals have to be killed in like a specific way because it is for a holy text, or?
Well, I don't know about the Jewish ones, do they?
Yeah, and there's
Okay.
only kosher animals are the only things that are allowed to be used for this parchment. And the curing process is a long one. Actually, DNA testing can also tell us the provenance where a particular manuscript comes from, because it's obviously goes back to an animal.
Yes. And with Christian texts, no. But in fact, the institution I just came from, I was involved in actually sending the tests of our 13th century French Bibles to a place in England to have them tested for what kind of animals they were. So that was fun. So do you guys want to come up? Okay. Great, come on up. And we do ask that you not touch the items in this class, but I do strenuously invite you to please come on your own and come into the reading room and look at materials on your own, and then you can touch things as much as you like. And I'm happy to show you how to use special collections and so forth. But in a class context, we just kind of ask that only the curators and the instructors touch the items.
So back in the old days, they used to make you wear gloves when you worked in manuscripts, and then they found that those actually were more damaging because the
Yes.
fibers in the gloves were worse than hand oil.
So if you've ever played in a handbell choir, you turn the pages that you wrote them.
There's a whole list in the conference.
And these are very heavy, so if you actually looked at a book or a codex that's made out of that has parchment pages as opposed to paper ones, they're very heavy. So yeah, this is a very heavy scroll. Plus, of course, the wood dowels that it's on add to that considerably.
So I just want to point out a couple of features of a Bible manuscript in the Hebrew tradition. One is whenever there are injunctions that are sort of primary commandments, they're written in a different collimation, the justification, let's use that modern term, for how the text is spread out on the page is different. I don't know if you can see, there's all these spaces left. Each injunction stands on its own and it has these spaces left between them, so you can see, the sort of the visuality of the concrete commandments. In the 10 Commandments, which we're not going to scroll back to because it's like 2/3 of the way back, they're actually written in two matching columns, 5 and 5, along the same concept as when you see the tablet sort of recreated. If you were in class with us on Monday, we saw the tablet sort of 1 through 5 and 6 through 10 on the other side. That comes from this manuscript tradition. Likewise, there are other certain prominent texts like the Song of Moses, the Song of the Sea just after the Israelites crossed the Red Sea, as Moses is taking them out of Egypt from slavery, where that is also set off from the page and columnated in a poetry form. So you've got a kind of design, and there's certain letters. I don't know if you can see, all these letters are kind of roughly the same size in terms of, if you were to talk about type font size, they would all be about the same. There are a couple of letters in the Torah that are also written exceptionally large, double or triple size, and that's also to point out features that are important text. It's a way that the tradition of manuscript writing could point to, without drawing arrows, important aspects of the text. And then both of these are chanted in the context of the synagogue worship. Each scroll has its own chant tradition, and the Torah, the 5 books, are chanted differently than other text. So these two would have two different cantillation traditions associated with them. Any questions about?
So that's are like, those are two separate pieces, right, that are sewn together?
Yes, so you can see here there are little stitch marks along, they seam the parchment together so that it becomes one long scroll. And then they score, if you look really carefully, you can see that they've taken like basically a ruler and a blank pointer and scored and created lines so that that's how it's so straight and beautiful. And then finally, the scribe will come and write copy from another version, this Torah. And then it has to be checked and double checked, and then they can make corrections by scraping away. That's the advantage of using vellum, is that you can scrape away, they're fairly thick, and then correct it as it goes. And they need to be maintained because this ink tends to crumble over time. Other questions? Okay. All right, we can go back to our seats already.
Okay.
And if you haven't gotten close, circle around and come and see.
Here's your last chance for the day.
Why, this one's bigger? Yeah, because it's used every week.
Oh,
This is
no.
only used once a year.
No, I meant like this, like the physical handle on this one is bigger than one.
It's not always that way.
Oh, okay. I was just curious.
That varies a lot. And the ornamentation of those dowels also varies tremendously.
So the next, I think that maybe I could show the Rabbinic
Great.
Bible next. Okay, since we're just looking at Hebrew things here. These. So this is a Rabbinic Bible. And the complicated thing about all these Bibles that I brought out is, of course, they all have at least 2 volumes. So I brought all the volumes of each one, just in case, whatever you wanted to look at. Now, I wanted to say that the interesting thing about many of these Bibles, do you think it should? Yeah, maybe open it a little bit more. Oh, the other side. That's right. These open backwards.
Right,
I
and
forgot for just a
Hebrew is
moment.
written from right to left, like
Yeah.
most all Semitic languages, and so.
Yeah. I just came from a library where we only had one printed Hebrew Bible, but it actually opened from the front, from our way, instead of the other one. It was a Ferrara Bible. So it was actually in Spanish, so maybe that's why. And otherwise, I'm used to working with manuscript Bibles, and then I remember to open it from. Sorry. So anyway, so this is a Rabbinic Bible, and many of these Bibles are from this collection from Elizabeth Prothero, and so she's one of the great benefactors. She and her husband are great benefactors to the Perkins School of Theology, and she had this phenomenal Bible collection that she gave to the Bridwell. So this came from that collection. So I'm just going to, since I'm unfamiliar with these books a little bit myself, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about this. This is actually printed in the whoever was over here who asked about Gutenberg. So Gutenberg printed the Gutenberg Bible between 1450 and 1455. Anything from the Gutenberg Bible through and inclusive of the year 1500 is called an incunabulum or incunable. So those are all called incunabula, books printed in that 50-year period in the West. But even the things that were printed in the 1500s after that are still considered very early printing. So this is a pretty old book. These were printed in between 1546 and 1548, and they were printed in Venice by a guy named Daniel Bomberg. But in any case, this is called the Mikrayot Gedalot, or the Rabbinic Bible, and it wasn't even printed or put into print. They were only in manuscript until 1516. And it contains the Hebrew scriptures and the traditional commentaries called the Targumim. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Absolutely.
Okay.
These are paraphrastic translations into Aramaic from the original Hebrew text that, for some reason, the tradition, even though Aramaic was no longer the spoken language, originally these were translations to enable people to understand the text because they spoke Aramaic. That was the vernacular. And then that tradition of keeping hold of that original vernacular translation was propagated even though people started speaking Spanish and Italian and lots of other languages, because it was thought to preserve commentary. Paraphrastic means that you don't just translate word for word, but you also include traditions that are associated with those passages. So they become preservers of interpretations, and so that's why they're preserved.
Right, and so this, well, it's also very interesting because many of these very early printers, including these printers in the so-called Incanabula period, many of these printers were Jewish and were printing for Jewish communities, and they were living in places like Portugal until the Jews were expelled from Portugal, and many of them actually went to Italy from Portugal and to places like that. So this probably falls into that tradition. So this is an edition of that rabbinic Bible. So and it has this lovely frontispiece with this architecture in it and everything. So so there's actually 2 volumes of it, but I think this is the first volume, and you should
Why don't
come up and look at it.
the illustration. So you'll notice, come on up. There are 2 types of illustrations. This is an architectural framing of the text. That's not meant to illustrate what the text is about. It just frames the text. And then you have illustrated text where they actually are trying to picture what the text is describing. This is not that. This is just a way of ornamenting the opening of the text. It has nothing to do with the content of the text.
And as you're looking at these printed books, look at it, look more closely, actually go and look at it. You need to understand that every single one of those characters that you see, that are like letters, that are Hebrew characters, every single one of those is actually carved by the printer. He made those, he carved them into a punch, and then they had to be physically laid out and then printed, okay? That is how printing worked until like the 1980s. It's very, very labor intensive. You have to appreciate every single book you look at printed before 1980 from now on.
You'll notice that the way that the layout on the pages is really different than how we lay out book pages,
Yes.
right? What do you notice that's different about the layout on the page?
A lot of like white space.
Yeah, there's all these white spaces. And come closer so you can actually see the writing. Don't worry about you reading on it. What do those white spaces mark off, do you think?
Paragraphs, the breaks in the pages.
Okay, some of them are paragraphs when they're up in one, but don't they look like blocks of text? Right? You can see that that's one square, that's another, or a rectangle, that's another, and that's another. Each of those blocks of text represents a different, either the text itself, which is here, the Targum, which is that Aramaic translation, which is here, and all of this around that border is the commentary that developed. A Mikra Gedalot has traditionally assigned 4 principal medieval commentators, and so when they print the text, the text on which they're commenting from the Bible is in the middle, but everything else around it are the traditions that have accumulated for centuries subsequent to the canonization or the standardization of the biblical text. So that's what that is what distinguishes a rabbinic Bible, is that it has all of the rabbis' commentaries, not all, it has those rabbis' commentaries around the perimeter, and it became a format for then subsequently how the Talmud, which are traditions that are later than the Bible. Those rabbinic traditions are printed exactly the same way. So this is a model for how Jewish tradition is printed. And even today, when you go to buy a regular printed text, not an incunabula, but a regular printed text, it's printed like this. And they don't have to hand do. Everything's computerized now, but they still maintain this formatting. Yeah.
So cool.
Because traditions die really hard in printing. Yeah, it's fascinating.
Do they still do that with the like? I mean, or do people still buy like the canonical church? You know, the canon law.
People do, but
But it's not in that format.
not anymore.
Okay.
No.
It's like on the bottom of the page, like when you buy like a Norton.
Yeah,
literary
like
thing.
top. Well,
Okay.
critical editions. Yeah. So this is actually a form of a critical edition in
Yeah.
some regards. You know, where you have a text and then you have people discussing what the text means. That's a critical edition. And in modern scholarly context, what we often put in is not just commentary, but also different manuscript traditions. So if one manuscript says this word or spells this word a certain way and another says it that way, you have to look at the bottom, you have to look like the footnotes, you know, this bottom stuff to find out what the differences in manuscripts are. So this is a little bit of an early precursor to that. Are there any questions about the Rabbinic Bible or its tradition? Great, we can move on.
Is it one of the like squares? That's the Aramaic translation.
Yeah, the one on the left, and you'll notice, I don't know if you, that's a difference.
Yeah.
Difference too from this. So that's the text itself, that's the targum, and then these are the commentaries. And the way that this is written stands apart.
Were these like two different?
Those are also, that's the Rashi. That's probably another targum, yeah. Yeah, that's another targum.
Okay, so that's like part of this stuff.
So there's a couple of targums, not just one.
So these are a couple of Christian manuscripts. Maybe I can. So one is much earlier than the other, but they're both manuscripts, like we were just talking about. One is Armenian, and the other one is French. So the French one is a medieval manuscript. The Bridwell has about, 26 medieval manuscripts. And a lot of other manuscripts beyond that. In fact, Tim is the archivist here. So there's a lot of manuscripts in the archival material. Like I said, you know, when you're writing notes, you're making a manuscript. In Armenia, there's this tradition, in particular, they maintained a tradition of writing these gospel books. Now, gospel books And one thing that's really cool about these Armenian gospel books is gospel books have these things called canon tables in them. So what they have is they have all the 4 gospel books, and it's a way of lining up where in one gospel book, like Matthew will talk about this aspect of Christ's life, and then you know, John will talk about another, you know, whatever, and how it all lines up. And they're often beautifully decorated. They continue that tradition in these Armenian books. This one doesn't seem to have a canon table, but that's a really fun thing to look for if you get interested in this, you know. And also the gospel books of the Ottonian era. So shall we move on to the next thing?
Yeah,
Okay.
so I've got you switched over to webcam now.
Oh, lovely.
Because the battery's on the other side.
Great. Okay.
These technologies never fail, right? These books have been around for centuries. They don't need batteries. They're always there.
Now, Professor Lander asked for some Bibles in different European languages. So, of course, I felt like I needed to get Erasmus out. So Erasmus is the great humanist. And as Tim was pointing out earlier, does this work? Yeah, get that one out. Okay, thanks. He's the great humanist and very famously did his own translation of the Bible from the Greek. Big thing to do in the Renaissance is to know your Greek and know your Latin. So this is his translation from the Greek, and it has the Greek and the Latin side by side. Am I right? Yes. So you can get an idea of this. And this is printed by a very famous printer, sort of a remnant from the incunabula period. It was printed in 1519, but Froben in Basel was a very famous incunable printer. So there's that one, and then this, something totally different, a Slavonic. This is a Slavonic Bible. So, thank you. I'm not used to these. Okay. And this is very early as well. This is also from, I think it's from the 1600s. And so this is, where are my notes? It's the earliest Russian book in this library. But this is actually a reprint of the Ostrog Bible of 1581. So it's the first complete edition of the Bible in Old Church Slavonic, and it's the first printed in Cyrillic type. And it relies heavily on the Greek Septuagint and the Slavonic Bible of Archbishop Gennadius, who died in 1505, and I am unfamiliar with him. But it's it's got all these very interesting woodcuts in it. So this early printing, in order to print in the illustrations, they did, since you're printing, you're moving over from, actually drawing and painting things to actually, doing illustrations with the print way of doing things. And so they used woodcuts for a lot of these early printed books. And there are some very nice woodcuts throughout this. So you can kind of get an idea if you look at this Erasmus book. There's also some very nice woodcuts in here, or perhaps metal cuts. But you can get an idea of the absolutely beautiful typography in this book. It's a very famous book. Some of them were actually printed on vellum. And, there's canon tables in here too. And then here you can see just some very interesting woodcuts and an idea of this kind of very early Cyrillic typography.
And what you have represented here are the Eastern Church and the Western Church, right? This is the Eastern Church tradition, which is why it was copied directly from the Greek, because that became the canonical text for the Eastern Church, for the Orthodox Church. And then this is the Western, the Latin Church, preserved Latin that's why it's called often the Latin Church. So you've got this sort of the division of the two authorities, when this authority is under papal and this is under the patriarch. So there are two different authority traditions that are represented here. Come on up and look. You'll notice something in the Latin Bible, that the first letter, can everyone see that block there actually has a letter in it? What's that letter? M, right? So the first letters in manuscripts are called initials, and they are often written in like superscript. They're written larger to signify the beginning of a chapter or the beginning of a book. And so that tradition migrated from manuscripts into printing, and they often will have decorated features around them. They're not just large, but they have lots of images, or this is just non-imagery decoration. That one has very beautiful headers as well, and they're written in red. The contrast of ink is also something that's preserved from the manuscript tradition. Any questions about either of these?
The one on the right is written in Latin.
Well, if you look carefully, it's got, right, this, when we, can I turn to this page? Yeah, if you look on this page, you'll see that it's got two languages written, right? It's got the Greek on the left, actually it has, yeah. And then Latin, looks like Latin on the right, and Greek on the left.
It's a beautiful one.
Yeah, yeah. Can't really see it. Yeah, oh, sure.
And the world changing moment. Really, this was part of the move and part of Christianity to say we need to study texts in the original Greek. That we need to go back farther than the Latin Bible to get back to the roots of the church. And that got Erasmus labeled as a heretic. But it's the standard today for most Christian biblical research. Go back as far as you can in the original resources.
And Erasmus was not part of a Reformation. I mean, this was 2 years after Luther nailed the, 95 Theses. And so, and he was not part of that, but he was doing what the other reformers were doing in translating biblical texts. So.
And now it's standard in all Christian traditions, including Catholicism, to go back to the Greek. That's part of the revolution of the Catholic biblical tradition. Okay, great.
So going back to the Greek, then how come masses are still performed too?
Oh, so it's only for biblical scholarship. It's not for liturgical purposes. It's
Everything
only
else
for
is still-
study.
Everything else is still Latin based.
In the Western Church.
In the Western, yes.
Oh, that's like close. Okay. Maybe vinegar has to go on its own. Should we do vinegar next?
Okay. Those would be two.
Yeah, we'll have to use them. Okay, so Professor Lander had asked for an English illustrated Bible. There are a number of these. This one is very fun. This actually has a very nice and interesting binding. Notice that it has these ties that have these tassels on them. And it has these marbled end papers. This is marbling had become particularly prominent in the 18th and 19th centuries. It had been passed over to Europe from Turkey and from the Middle East, actually. And this actually belonged to the Earl of Itchester. So this has royal provenance. But this is called the Vinegar Bible. It was printed by a man named Baskett in Oxford in 1717. And it's called the Vinegar Bible because there are a number of these famous English language Bibles that have typographical errors. And it's called the Vinegar Bible because in the parable of the vineyard, he accidentally types vinegar at the top. Or they typeset it, and because it was typesetting. So in Luke 20, we have the parable of the vinegar. And so that's why it gets its name. But it's also beautifully illustrated throughout with what are called engravings. Engravings, as opposed to, well, woodcuts tends to be things that are carved in relief. So what you would do is if you carved an illustration in a block of wood, what's sticking out is what you press upon the paper or whatever you're making your print upon. An engraving is usually something called an intaglio method of printing. So what you engrave into a metal plate or something, whatever is inside the groove is what's filled with the ink, and that's what is pressed onto the paper or whatever you're printing upon. And so that's what these engravings are probably intaglio engravings. And so you can get an idea here of this beautiful engraving. Just going to save this page for the parable of the vinegar. So you guys can come up and have a look at this. Now this is the size of what a lot of Bibles tend to be for lectern use, used in a church or for some kind of larger use. So, Tab, come on up and look.
So you'll notice something in these Bibles that's different from the earlier ones that we were looking at is the chapterization. The indication of chapter and verse is something that was relatively late in importing into the tradition and was imported into Christian tradition first and then borrowed back into Jewish tradition from how Christian Bibles were printed. So the indication right up here of chapters and then if you look along the side of verses, that's relatively new and late to the tradition printing.
Here's the parable of the vinegar up here. It doesn't have any pictures, but here's the running head. And there's also, there's a very early one. I can't remember. I think it's from the Great Bible, or maybe it's Coverdale. I can't remember where it's the Bug Bible. Nor shalt thou be afraid of any bugs at night, and some other things like that. And then Tim had just pointed out, asked which version of the Bible this is. I thought maybe I could look at the front here. It only says that it is revised by His Majesty's special command. So this would have been, let's see, Queen Anne died in 1714. So who is that? That's King George the First. Yeah, King George the First. So King George the First, who didn't really speak English. Well, anyway, so so that's the Vinegar Bible. We can figure out what version it is. If any of you are curious, just send us an email and I can find out for you. But these English Bibles are a lot of fun for a lot of reasons, as you can well imagine, with Henry VIII and Elizabeth I and all that Tudor history. And they are all very well represented in these collections. Okay.
We're running into the end of our class, so.
Okay, so what do you want? Do you want a Dutch Bible? Do you want an Italian Bible?
It's up to you.
Dutch or Italian or let's do this German one. This is an incunable. This is a very famous Bible. It's called the Coburger Bible. And they actually printed what is called the Nuremberg Chronicle, which is a very famous incunable. But there's a lot of copies of it, like everyone has a copy. It's still an incunable, but anyway, so this is a translation of the Bible into German that was printed in 1483. And there's 2 volumes of it, and many copies of it, the woodcuts throughout have been hand colored. So they weren't printed in color because color printing was not perfected in the West until the 1840s. So this was 1483, not printed in color. They had to be hand colored after the fact. But sometimes they're also illuminated in gold, just like the manuscripts were being done at the time. So you can come up and take a look here at Genesis. This is a very interesting woodcut for many reasons. And you can see the tooling and the gold and everything else. It's a very pretty, this one's been very prettily done. And you can see that the typeface is kind of like a cursive. It's very interesting. So you might want to just come up and take a look at that.
And also note the coloration is very distinctive to this particular printer.
Yes.
Whoever they had coloring in the lines.
In Nuremberg.
Yeah. It's very distinctive. The Chronicle has these exact same hues.
No.
It's really,
Yeah.
you can almost tell.
And like every copy you see, it's like the same. This is another fun way to go. I mean, if any of you are interested in art history or art history majors, what do those woodcuts mean, you know?
Okay, I'll see you on Friday. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for coming. And please, thank you. And please feel free to come back and visit us. Just drop by, call from the reference desk. Let me know that you're here, and I will come and get you, and we will talk about special collections. That will be awesome.
Contact information is on